Okay. Yeah, so I guess maybe that's a good way to think about it. Is like there's the app factor, right? Which is the local, indigenous, people to people, community factor, and then there's the larger investor framework aspect. So. And here's Jose. Hey, Jose, perfect timing.
Hey, Jose.
Hey, everybody.
Hello. All right.
Hello.
So, Clint, Jose, Chanzo, Ali Itasi. Yes.
Chanzo. Hi, Ali Itasi.
Hey.
Nice to meet you all.
All right. So we just uploaded this the document in called IE 5-year strategic plan, which is in the chat section. So maybe if you wanted to download that very quickly, then you can look at what's on page 342. No, it's on page page 3. Yeah, which
I can't see the chat history because of when I joined. So if you can repost it or just email it to me, that'd be great.
Actually, I'll email it to you.
Okay, super, thanks.
Okay, one moment. Talk amongst yourself while I do this.
So you figured out the next 5 years, I hear.
Alleged.
Impressive. I came at the right time. It's all figured out.
That 5-year strategic plan. Do it this way.
And then one of the things Arnie's been talking about is linking sort of the equations features to investment mechanisms. And while I'm familiar with the equation stuff and environmental stuff, investment stuff, I have very little capacity. So I'm very open to learning about how that intersects with this.
I guess I could start. Generally describe sort of from a big picture standpoint, how
Okay, I just sent it. Sorry.
Credit default swap sort of became the vision of how to essentially create an asset for countries or peoples to have. And so when Arnie and I first started talking about this, what we were trying to figure out is how people or countries could essentially somehow have access to financing that occurred through means that would not have strings attached to it. In other words, when you go through a entity like the World Bank, for example, and you borrow money from them, then there are typically strings attached that come with the financing that won't necessarily benefit the people who are borrowing the money. And so we started to think about how we would go about creating something that would allow essentially people to borrow money, not going through those channels. And what we thought about was, if you're a borrower trying to borrow money, how do lenders look at you as an entity, as a borrower? And we went through different thoughts about assets, cash flows, just when you think about a borrower borrowing money, what is a lender going to look at that would make them feel comfortable allowing you to borrow money? One of the things that became apparent is that what the amount of assets or real assets that a country or a people has is really important for a lender to extend credit to a borrower. And we're trying to figure out how to create something that would be of value to people or to countries that was tied to the concepts that Arnie was creating through his equation of national accounting. And in essence, through that process, we tried to figure out a way to create a security that would be an asset that would be held by people in countries or indigenous people that have been harmed by the degradation of the environment, and to create something that would potentially be tradable in global markets, and in essence would again be tied to the degradation of one's ecological assets, one's environment. And so what we came up with was essentially, and it ties into Arnie's equation in many ways, but let's start with the baseline that's sort of fundamental to the ecological accounting system that Arnie has put forth. So you have a baseline here, and you have where we are today, which has deviated from that baseline by a certain amount. And the idea is you want to get things back to baseline over time so that people can live, a healthy lives, productive, good quality lives. And what we came up with is something that is essentially similar to what is called a credit default swap. What a credit default swap is it is an instrument that usually is purchased or speculated on that is tied to a particular piece of debt. And in essence, the way that it works is that an investment bank will issue this credit default swap, and an entity who holds it will pay a premium. It's essentially an insurance premium in the event that this debt defaults. And so if you sort of think of that concept, so you have an investment bank that creates the security, you have the holder of the credit default swap who pays the investment bank a premium on an ongoing basis to have this insurance against the debt actually defaulting. And if the debt defaults, and you have to be very clear in the contract what constitutes a default, then in essence, the investment bank pays a certain amount, typically the debt that has been defaulted on, that much to the holder of the credit default swap. And so think of it this way. I'm an investor. I own 100 million in Google bonds, and I'm worried that Google is going to default on their bonds. So I would go to an investment bank and say, I'd like to have a credit default swap that is going to cover me if Google defaults on their bonds. Now, in this case, Google's a very strong company. And so if I approach an investment bank, the premium that I would have to pay to have this insurance would be very low. On the other hand, if Google was stressed and potentially was going to default on its debt, the premium I would have to pay to hold this credit default swap is quite large, be quite large. And in this situation, think of the investment bank as sort of an insurance company that's trying to figure out what the premiums would be to that a holder of it would have to pay in order to make it attractive to the insurer, where the insurer is trying to assess what the risks are that there will be a default and how much do they have to be compensated to essentially accept that risk. And so let's say that Google's bonds default. And so in 100 million defaults, I, an investor, hold 100 million of it and the value goes to zero. In this situation, the investment bank who created the credit default swap would have to pay me 100 million for the defaulting debt. And that's essentially the way that a credit default swap works. It can be complex sounding, and so I want to make sure that what I'm describing is clear. And so if anyone has any questions, how it works, I'd be happy to go over it in any way that makes it easier to understand. And then I can tie it into the equation once we sort of understand the basics of the credit default swap.
Thank you, Clint. Really appreciated that. That's a really cool idea. So can I ask you a few questions?
Of course, please.
So the owner of the credit default swap would be the impacted communities, is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And then they would pay a premium for the insurance based on who's the credit holder?
Well, so I guess if we're gonna move there, I guess the way, so we've talked about in many ways who would pay the premium,
Okay.
right? And it wouldn't be the people that are holding the credit default swaps. It would actually be, we've talked about potentially the EU being the premium payer.
Got it.
An entity that recognizes the impact that has occurred, feels that some form of equalization, I guess for a lack of a better term, that people who have been affected that have not benefited as much as industrialized countries, that an entity like the EU would pay the premiums in essence. And the default scenario would in essence be, we were thinking that, let's say that the baseline is here, where we are is here, you would basically put a default scenario up here. And so if degradation occurred more and more, the value of this credit default swap would increase because it's getting closer and closer to that point of default. So the value of it would rise. You would also potentially stagger the levels of default that are indicative of more and more degradation. And so you would have the premiums paid by an external entity. The holders of the credit default swap would be, the people that have been impacted. And if their environment, as measured by, either, we've been talking about more of the country level or regional level data that would be fed into an equation that would then determine how close you are to reaching that threshold where you in essence have to pay out the value of the credit default swap. And so as things degraded, the value of the security would increase. And then ultimately, if it degraded to a certain level, then that would constitute a default. And then there would be a sum of money that would then be paid out by, in this case, the investment bank, who again would act like an insurance company that is taking on that risk, but they're also being asked, or they're also asking there to be insurance premiums paid for them to assume the risk of default.
So why would the external entities buy into that?
That's where, that's not honestly my category.
Sorry.
That's well, I mean, it's a means that they wouldn't have to pay it all up front. It's a insurance premium. How much that premium is will be a function of how much would need to be paid out in a default scenario, and how far away you begin the process away from that default scenario. And so there's a lot of components that would still need to be worked on to determine these things.
Right.
But
Okay.
the concept is that you would have an entity that recognizes the damage that has been done, that
Okay.
has money allocated to address the impact that has occurred. And in doing it this way, in essence, you would be providing an asset to the people that have been affected so that they'll have an asset, and then they would in turn be able to borrow money for development under terms that are more favorable than would likely exist without it.
Okay. Because like my area was mining, and I was looking at mining in Papua New Guinea, especially in the highlands, and there was a lot of degradation done within the highlands, especially by Barrick Gold. So how would you, the investment bank, persuade Barrick Gold to actually become part of this? Or
That
is that not your job?
no, I mean, I think there is a broader movement in a lot of places within corporations and in the finance industry, the investments industry as well,
Right.
that are trying to act more and more responsibly. And how far that movement can take the process and have a Barrick Gold actually pay the premiums on that. That I think the concept can be applied in many ways, in a micro and a macro level. This
Mm.
concept of environmental degradation, I know data collection is something that is becoming more and more prominent across the world. And so, the concept where you're collecting data that then is fed into an index like this that will move up and down depending upon how far away you're moving from baseline.
Okay.
And then ultimately the holder of this being compensated if you're moving further and further away to a level that would essentially constitute a lot of harm, that would be like a default scenario in what I'm describing. I think it could be applied in a lot of different situations. I think right now we're talking about more macro, bigger, country, regional level data sets,
Yep.
but I think it could also be applied to something like you mentioned. It's very interesting because I never really thought about it that way, but it can certainly be applied to that, where measures on a micro level around a mine could be evaluated, could be taken in, and you could have a before the mine started level, and then where you are level, and then
Yeah.
if it gets to a certain level above that, then it's like there's a payout. I think the concept will work there as well.
And
There's
you
one
al-
more thing.
Yeah,
Sorry.
you also have to include the corporate social responsibility, which is not with the paper it's actually written on, but it sounds good. I don't know if you've read any of the if you've read any of the corporate social responsibility documents. But
I
I mean,
haven't.
if you have a look at what they actually claim to do and what they actually do, there is an accountability in terms of costs that could be claimed through that. I'm just kind of thinking outside the box. I don't
No,
know.
I mean, that's interesting. I think if a country had control over who they would allow into their country to mine, setting up something like this to me would make a lot of sense.
Yep.
Especially if you started it at the beginning of a project where there is no damage, and then as things creep up where there's more and more damage, and you get closer and closer to that line where it constitutes a default, so to speak,
Mm,
and then they have to pay out. I mean, that makes a lot of sense, because it's, if you can ensure that the data is legitimate and everyone is comfortable with how it's collected, and then I think you could establish these things up front, and actually have a system like that that would, at the mine level in this case, to me, work pretty well. There's one more thing that I think is worth mentioning before we go on, and which is, if the baseline is here and we're here and the trigger is here, if things get better and better and better and better, the value of the credit default swap actually declines. And so it's something that, and you get further and further away from, you know, having to pay out the default situation. So, you know, if things got better, which I think everyone would like to happen, then the value of the asset would actually decline, because you're moving further and further away from the default scenario and closer to the level where the baseline exists, where you know, the environment, at least according and measured by the different factors that are part of the equation, are at a level that's, you know, sustainably positive.
cool. Sorry about the nasty questions.
Oh, no, I know it's an interesting, perhaps complex thing that's being proposed, but you know, it's important that you all understand why it's
Yep.
being proposed and the different components and how it would work. And so, you know, I'm happy to answer any questions. Please keep them coming. That's why I'm here, just
Yep.
to help out.
I guess I just wanted to add to that, in terms of like, for example, your example with the mine in Papua New Guinea, right? I
Oh.
mean, if there could be many different many of those factors, and various groups, indigenous groups, or, you know, communities could begin to sort of aggregate certain indexes, certain events together into a package, and that package, you know, could be its own thing. So I just wanted to throw that out there, but
Yep.
please continue.
And it could be a single thing as well. It could be a single measure that is measured, and then it could be several that are put together into one more collective security that tracks more than one factor, more than one environmental measure.
So in this conception, Clint, the person who is paying the premium, or the party that's paying the premium, is the government?
That's how we've talked about it. You know, that's,
Or a bank.
Or a bank?
well, I mean, they would have to want to, in essence, financially support a impacted group of people,
Right.
because of, for whatever reason, whether it's they want to appear to be helping, they want to actually help, they feel that the damage has been done and they're trying to therefore help people that they've hurt. Those would be the different reasons why I think they would do it. And again, the amount of premiums that would be paid would be a function of how much the investment bank would have to pay out in a default scenario. And again, you know, how far you are away from that default scenario from happening. And so
Okay.
that's where you can tweak things to make it cheaper or more expensive for the premiums to be.
Okay, but let's assume then that the surveillance and the monitoring evaluation is all accurate, and There's no cheating going on with the, you know, monitoring of how close we are to that threshold, right? But if our objective is to redistribute wealth at a global scale, and we have a government that's paying premiums to a private operator, that of course would be making sure that its, you know, its risk profile is not too hurt by the products that it's issuing.
Mhm.
Are we in a situation where you have a government basically absorbing potential losses for the actions of a private sector that's engaged in, you know, pollution or extraction in the same country that they're paying the premiums for?
Good question.
So
for
are you saying that let's say government in country A is paying the premiums, but companies in country A are causing the environmental damage?
Right,
And
and they
so,
see that the profits they can make, the margin is way too attractive to, you know, let it pass by. So they're willing to absorb whatever taxes or fines they might incur from their own government, continue with the activity, make their profits, and then it's the actual taxpayer in the same country that's now absorbing the loss through their,
gotcha.
you know, their relationship to government.
Yeah, I guess the way that we were thinking about it is that the entity paying the premiums would
Right?
not be the government, that the environmental data for this particular credit default swap would be related to.
Okay.
So in other words, in the example that we just talked about,
Right.
country government of country B would be paying the premiums for environmental data and the environmental situation in country A, whose government would not be paying the premiums, and whose companies would be causing the economic and the environmental damage by industry.
Sorry, can you run that by me again? So country, yeah,
So I think what we were talking about is a situation where country A government is paying premiums on a
yeah,
credit default swap related to the environment of country A. And the companies, the industries in country A are doing environmental damage, but their taxpayers are essentially paying the premium for the government to pay on this credit default swap. The government owns a credit default swap. They'll make a good amount, they'll make some money if the thresholds are breached, and the taxpayers are paying for that. And so it's sort of this circle of negative situations, just where more money is being made off making things worse.
yeah.
Yeah. So I guess what we were thinking was that instead of government A paying the premiums that were related to a credit default swap for country A's environment, instead country B, I guess we were thinking like the EU would be paying the credit default swap premiums,
Yeah.
and then country A would benefit if it went and it defaulted. And so, but I guess, you bring up a good point. I think that that's an interesting element to it all, which is, how do you make sure the people benefit as opposed to a government that is corrupted, that would prefer to, make more money than preserve the environment, preserve the well-being of its own people. How that
Yeah.
would work, that's a tough question because, ideally, the value of these credit default swaps would be large in a default situation, so that the asset that the people have will compensate them in some way of them being harmed, them and their environment being harmed. But how the payout then, or what entity actually holds it, and then who is actually paid out, and how that would then flow from whatever entity that receives it to the actual people that should benefit. Um, I've gotta think more about that, to be honest.
Okay.
It's not a layer that I've thought about yet.
Okay, well,
Un-
I'm just gonna say that for me, it's if country B, which is paying the premium, is the EU, and country A, which is the country whose biodiversity is involved there, would receive the payment from the investment bank if these thresholds were to be surpassed, right? If the private sector in the EU is involved in Guyana, let's say, for example, and realizes that what is going to happen is the EU, the government, is going to tax its own people to pay the premiums, and then that loss will not really impact the private sector, it will impact the people of the country. So I'm thinking if we're talking about redistributing wealth and at a global scale, I think creating a situation where there may be negative redistribution of wealth in the north, and maybe kind of the replacement of ecological wealth with financial wealth in the south may not reach the goal that we're trying to have, the effect that we're trying to have.
Gotcha.
So,
I would add that that on the micro level, where where groups and communities are beginning to do their their exchanges.
Negotiations, yeah.
Yes, that I do think that there will be financial growth on that end, but more
Yeah.
than that, it's also just access to services. And I think it's for these communities to develop their own services, to develop their own technologies, to be able to to move outside of their communities if that was their interest, or to work with other communities. Like, having that access is part of the redistribution of this wealth, because it's not necessarily even tied so much to money, because I think that from a legal perspective, that I think governments are going to not all governments are going to distribute money the same way across the board. Some governments will be will look at, some communities will want money, some communities might not want money. They might want services, or they might want other access. They might want other like regulatory conditions. There may be other things that are at stake other than just simply money. So that's would be
so maybe I can ask another question. So if in the process of collecting the data, we have a certain threshold that's established, and the financial instruments are based on those thresholds, and then you have a massive discovery of hitherto unknown natural resources, etc. Does that affect the underlying value of the derivative, or is it that the value is just fixed, and then you would have to create another instrument to account for natural resources or factors that haven't been bundled into that instrument?
I think you could create another one.
Okay.
You know, these most typically the credit default swaps are very customized, and they're very specific as to what constitutes a default.
Right.
And in this case, there would be a certain number or a single measure, environmental factor that is agreed to, that the level of baseline is agreed to, the where we are now is agreed to, the way that the values are calculated are agreed to, the threshold level is agreed to. They're very customized, and so you know to answer your question, Chanzo, I would think that you would create another one. You could then make it specific to the mine. You could then make it broader or more valuable, or you know, there's a number of things that you could do depending upon how things evolve, how things change. There won't be really necessarily a standard set of measures per security. It can change to whatever you want it to be. You'd have to be, you know, negotiating in essence with the investment bank because everyone would have to look at the risk reward, so to speak, meaning that they would have to assess, you know, how much is it going to be in premiums in order to compensate me to take on this risk.
Yeah.
And so depending upon all those different factors, you know, a lot of math would be done and you'd have to agree on all these different things. But, you know, in short, to answer your question, I think in the situation you described, I think you would just create another one. And I would think the intention would be to be able to do that in many different situations, whether it's macro, whether it's micro, whether it's threshold here or threshold here or threshold here. You'd probably want to do several.
All right. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I'm really intrigued by this, Clint. I appreciate your sharing and offering this. It's something we can work with and start to tease out. And Chanzo's questions and the other questions are right on. So it gives us something to work with.
But the funny thing is that the two of you were actually working together, even though you didn't know it. And that's like the thing that's like funny to me, that you're actually only just meeting now, because this, I mean, the two of you in many ways, you know, constructed the equation, you know, based off of you know, an idea. And so
Good to finally meet you, Jose.
Likewise, Clint. Likewise. And I am thrilled because yeah, now we can sort of tease these things out and you know, look for unexpected problems, as Chanzo was pointing out, and was pointed out about the Papua New Guinea, and how we can avoid them. I mean, you know, and also think about the price. You know, what is this payout? You know, because in theory, you want the default payout to be enormous enough that it doesn't happen. So that you get improvements in the environment first and foremost. So trying to value that is going to be something that we work on. And it would be great to be able to force companies to pay these premiums, but we're not there. But so, you know, sort of what's the carrot? How do we inspire people to invest in this is a big question.
Yeah, I think in thinking through and talking through things here, I think ultimately if companies were the payers of the premiums, that would actually work really well. There are issues certainly with you know, who's going to get the money, how is it going to be distributed, and all of that. And you know, I can start to try to think about those things, and I'm glad that, you know, these things that have been brought up. I appreciate that, Chanzo.
Yeah.
And yeah, I'll do more thinking about it, about how it could be more tight, and how it would work and who would get paid. And but I think the concept with it makes a lot of sense. It's intersecting a lot of different things in the world right now, including data collection, and being able to, in essence, force polluters to, or those that damage the environment, to actually have to pay premiums on something that would then benefit the people that are being harmed.
Absolutely. You know, and Chanzo, you really picked out that scenario because, you know, in theory, if it's the Western country taxpayers paying out, then there is some redistribution. But in fact, they'll be paying for the polluters to make more money. So that's
Yeah.
that's really insightful, and trying to figure out how to break that pattern.
Wow.
I think something
mean,
to wrestle with.
Yeah. The thing I look at is that, you know, we're in a post-colonial, ex-colonial type of situation where many times the taxpayers of the North are really migrants from the South, from the same countries, who, in addition to sending remittances back and so forth, are paying their fair share, if not more, of taxes to, you know, the countries that they're resident in. So the identity of those taxpayers is also kind of my area. So that's what I would look at if we were to talk about redistribution at the global scale, because you have a lot of people who, if you're looking at an investment relationship, usually investment relationships follow colonial paths, right? So, you know, the Dutch invest in the former Dutch colonies, et cetera, et cetera. So the people who are actually paying that tax bill are not necessarily divorced from the global South.
Then could you, and maybe after this, just write, or just a quick summary of, again, who the parties are, because, and then we can kind of think of each of these little boxes who are involved in the credit default swap. That might help me start
Sure.
to wrestle with the different parties. And
I mean, it could be called something other than a credit default swap. It's just that's what it's modeled after.
yeah.
Sure, I'd be happy to do that.
Yeah, because in each element, like for example, the community holding the credit default swap, like that becomes a whole thing to figure out, like, you know, an equitable entity and ensuring proper distribution, sort of, you know, so there's that whole thing. How do we make sure that it's held equitably and honorably? And then the whole like premium payer, and then the whole the polluter. So yeah, there's all these kind of little pieces.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I guess I would reiterate that, you know, the concept was created so that affected people would have an asset that would allow them to then go beyond the more traditional financing for development that would not be with strings attached. And so, Chanzo, you mentioned the colonial sort of history of different areas, and that it comes, with investment. I guess the whole the thinking behind this was to sort of avoid that, where the people that have been affected would have something of value that would enable them to then go out and borrow money without strings attached. And I think the equation also that, you know, that Arnie's created and, you know, everyone's sort of been working on is meant to help in the same way, where, you know, you're giving people more more of what they should have, but they just don't right now, and so that they can be more independent and have access to financing that they would otherwise not have. But now, if they have an asset that is valuable, that is meaningful to a lender, then it changes the situation.
And Tasi, I really appreciated your example, because that example with the mining, like we need to figure out a way that works for that. So that really grounds it. I think that's a great one to flesh out.
Yeah. Well, the mining over there was really messy, very, very messy.
Yeah.
I mean, it's something that it would seem, you know, the government who's awarding the permits and allowing these companies to operate within their borders, that they would be the ones that would have to force the corporations to actually enter into something like this as a something that must happen in order for them to operate. I think the government itself would have to force corporations to do it.
Yeah, the other thing too is that what we've also found in terms of a lot of the mining and also other things that have gone on in PNG is that the negotiation skills of the people that come up against these corporations, their needs, it's definitely an unequal playing field. And so that's what we kind of talked about, was leveling up the playing field. And, you know, so that kind of never happened. But even that's a skill that can be brought into it. But yeah, that's just me. So anyway, sorry about that.
That's okay.
Oh, it's good. Gosh.
You know, unfortunately, I walked away from academia. Just got sick of it.
Maybe Jose, maybe you could you introduce yourself to Ali Itasi and what it is that you do with you know, with both the EPA and North American indigenous communities or the tribes?
Yeah, I'm happy to. So my day job, but I've been taught that I have to separate my day job from our conversation on this, but I'm happy to share with you what my day job is. I'm a scientist with the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, and my main job is engaging with indigenous communities and tribes in scientific research and working in spaces about data protection and indigenous knowledge and ways of viewing. And so that's what I get to do during the day. But the auspices for my engagement with you, according to what I told them, is I'm also very involved in my faith communities and the World Council of Church stuff. And so that's kind of the hat that I'm wearing here. But all that information is in my head.
Lovely. Lovely to meet you.
An honor to meet you too.
And then I guess Clint, I mean, maybe if you could introduce yourself, because I don't think, because neither Jose, Chandra, Ali Itasi know what you do, so I mean, maybe it'd be great just to.
I work for a public pension plan. So the specific plan I work for is a plan called Alameda County. It's in California. We're headquartered in Oakland, and so what we do is we we manage a investment fund that provides retirement and health benefits to the former employees of Alameda County. And there, I cover a few asset classes: private credit, absolute return, real assets, fixed income, debt-related special situations. And so those particular asset classes, I deal with on a daily basis. And our job is to invest the fund's money, basically. And we typically do that by hiring investment managers and try to put together, portfolios of different strategies that will produce the kind of risk and return we're looking for. And we have increasingly become more and more, ESG oriented. And so, considerations like these, sorry, Chanzo, am I kind of quiet?
No, no.
Okay.
No,
So, we've increasingly become more and more ESG oriented, environmental, social, governance, ESG oriented in what we do, what we won't do. And, I've been close with Arnie for a while, so I'm trying to use my know-how and try to help out.
thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So, yeah, anyway, thank you very much, Clint and Jose and Chanzo and Ali Itasi for coming to this special engagement for Clint's wonderful lecture on on the investment stuff that I've never been able to that I've just never been able to reiterate with the kind of patience and clarity that that you have. And I guess, and the same thing with you as well, Jose. I mean, it's as I'm talking about the equation as well, I mean, hearing you describe it to other scientists in the room is always a privilege, because it's like, wow, you've really done something amazing. And then of course, the ethics, behind this, really does come from Ali Itasi and Chanzo, and the work that just been able to do over the years. I mean, there's a strong, moral base where this comes from, and it really does, evolve from our work. So it's it feels this feels very cohesive. I wish Tim were here, because he's sort of like the policy magnate in all of this, but I've recorded this and he'll get it, and I think he'll be really happy. And then I guess if we have other questions, because I'm sure we will, then we'll come back and we can have this discussion more in depth and further. I do want to say that if you're looking at the 5-year strategic plan, you notice that there's a lot of question marks by names, and it's simply because we're thinking about it. But for example, considering Jose wanting to I haven't asked you yet whether or not you might want to co-chair the board of directors with with Transform. But so there's a big question mark there. It doesn't have to be answered now, but you can ask it. But anyway, but in terms of how the whole management thing has evolved. So I guess essentially the the organizing team, the corporate team, the 4 people. I mean, it's would be Tim, Chanzo, myself, and Ali Itasi. But a central committee is Clint, Samuel, and Jose. Like, so Samuel he lives in Nigeria, and but that you 3 would be sort of like like the central committee, and hoping to also steer this, and that's I guess the, you know, the sort of intellectual grouping of this. So we still haven't been all in the same room together. So it's unfortunate we're missing like Samuel and Tim, but at some point we will, especially when I share with them this recording. So
Alrighty.
Right.
so thank you, everybody.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Good.
Are there,
Nice
well,
to meet you all.
are there any other like questions or
I'll probably think of it once I hang up.
good.
I'll email everyone the simplified diagram of how it works, and if there are any questions that follow that, please reach out. Be happy to, you know, get into things further.
Okay.
Awesome. Thank you. And it was lovely to meet everybody.
Yeah.
Yes. Good to meet
Yes.
you all.
All
So
right.
till fast
Thank
way
you, Arnie,
four, I've got to
bringing
go.
everybody
My phone's been blowing up. So
Take
take
care.
care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Fast way four.
Okay. Have a good morning, evening, afternoon, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
So I'm around if you want. Oh, so if you want to continue speaking, I'm completely available, Chanzo.
Hey. Hey. Yeah.
He's good,
I-
right? He's
yeah,
so patient and methodical, and
yeah.
he's like, I got it, I get it, and then I forget it, and then then he speaks again. Oh, I got it, and then I forget it again.
Yeah, but